Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Nguyen. In this lecture, I will be giving you an introduction on literary analysis. I will be talking about what it means to write about literature, to analyze a specific work of literature. All right, I am in our Blackboard homepage. Let me turn on the student preview mode so that we can see the course content as you actually see it when you log in. All right, I am going to locate the PowerPoint file that I've uploaded to Module 1 as a visual aid for my discussion, for my lecture on literary analysis. All right, so you can look in the table of contents for Module 1, and the file is called, give me just one sec, Literary Analysis Introduction. So you click on that, and it should open, the file should open. Okay, so this is just a little PowerPoint that I've created to introduce to my students the rhetorical mode for this first essay, which is the literary analysis essay. Right, before we go into the discussion itself, let me just say that you should not be viewing this lecture or listening to this lecture if you have not read the 2 short stories that I've assigned last week. Okay, last week in the lectures that I posted, I said at the beginning of each videos, I said that that the objective for last week was for you to locate and read the 2 short stories assigned. And just to briefly remind you, the 2 short stories that you should be reading are The Story of an Hour and Good Country People, and you should know where to locate those 2 if you've viewed my lectures, which you should have. All right, so let me start the slideshow here real quick. All right. Okay, so this lecture on literary analysis should be helpful to you if we were to view this visual aid or this PowerPoint presentation in conjunction to chapter 16 in your textbook. So as you're listening to this lecture, I would also like for you to have your textbook out and open to chapter 16. That should start on page 253. Okay. I will not go over the chapter in detail, but you should be, but if you have it opened in front of you, you should read the introduction on page 253, and you should be aware of the 4 ways or 4 approaches to literary analysis discussed at the bottom of page 254. Okay, that should give you an idea of how to approach that discussion at the bottom of page 254 should let you know of the 4 basic ways or 4 basic perspectives that you can have or that you can use to enter a text, right? To start your investigation of the meaning of a text. And I think that the essay on page 257, 4 ways to talk about literature, would further prove to be very helpful to explain to you or to expand on or to elaborate on these 4 approaches discussed on page 254. Okay, so in addition to that, also read this very helpful essay on page 257 called 4 Ways to Talk About Literature as a starting point for your introduction to literary analysis. And also on your own, you should read as just an opportunity for practicing your literary analysis skill. The very short poem called Let Evening Come on page 259 in your textbook. It is a short poem, but it is a poem that has very vivid imagery, and the imagery and the symbolic significance of these of the imagery in this poem, right, will help to illustrate to you, the process of literary analysis and what you are doing when you are looking at a work of literature such as the poem closely and trying to understand it in a deep, meaningful way. All right, and there is, I'm sorry, a sample literary analysis essay on pages 260 and 261. So it is a, let me see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraph essay. So it does follow this basic structure of the essay, 5 to 6 paragraph with its introduction, its body, and its conclusion. So after reading the poem Let Evening Come and kind of try to perform a close reading of it on your own, or analyze it in whatever ways, using whatever methodology or which of the 4 approaches that you want to kind of try to make some sense out of the poem, I would highly advise that you read the sample essay on the poem as well. Okay, so the sample essay of the poem Let Evening Come is on pages 260 to 261 in your textbook. So after having read that essay and also studied the essays, studied the structure, studied the different elements of literary analysis that the essay reflects, right, should give you a pretty good idea of what it is that you're supposed to do when you're analyzing or writing an analysis of a poem or a short story, but in our case it'll be short stories because the 2 texts that I've assigned are short stories. Okay, so chapter 16 should be very, very helpful in that sense, and you should have, a pretty a working understanding of these skills, of this type of analytical skills after you've read chapter 16. All right. Now, one of the 2 short stories assigned for reading is called Good Country People, and it is at the end of chapter 16. The full text is on page 264 to 278, I believe. Now, the full text for the other short story that you're also supposed to be reading and considering for your literary analysis essay is called The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, and you can access a full text version of it in online in our Blackboard module 1. Okay, you should know where to locate that as I showed you how in one of my earlier videos. Okay, now of course for your literary analysis essay you will get to choose which of the 2 short stories you want to write about. Okay, you do not write about both stories, and you will not be performing a comparison or contrast or comparison and contrast of the 2 short stories. You will pick only one and focus on some aspect and focus on, making some sense or getting some kind of insightful interpretation of some aspect of one of the 2 short stories, but not both. Now, if you take both, if you analyze both, you're not giving yourself an opportunity to really delve into the text as deeply as you could. Okay, and of course you will not get a good grade for that, for not following direction. Okay, but just for discussion purposes, I want you to read both stories so that at least you know which one you like better and which one you might be more interested in, analyzing for your essay. But the point that I was trying to make regarding the Good Country People, if this is your short story, is that at the end of chapter 16, after the story finishes, okay, it's a student sample essay on Good Country People. Okay, please note that I've taught this course for quite some time. I am very familiar with the short story. Well, I'm very familiar with what's in this chapter, and I'm very familiar with the sample essay on this short story, Good Country People. So do not even try to plagiarize the sample essay. the sample literary analysis essay that follows the text of Good Country People in your textbook. You will get caught, okay, as I've caught a couple of students in the past trying to, you know, borrowing or plagiarizing certain content of the sample essay and passing them off as their own. Okay, that is not acceptable. Now, you certainly feel free to read the sample essay, even though I would not recommend it, right? Because when you read it, and if your intention is to focus on this short story for your essay, and if you read the sample essay, you may be very tempted to plagiarize, or you will allow yourself to be very much influenced by the reading that the essay provides, right? And whether intentional or not, that influence will most likely make its way into your essay's content. And and if you're caught plagiarizing, you may fail the assignment. Okay, so that's just a word of caution, and you are advised to do what you are warned against. All right. Okay, so please, literary analysis essay is not an easy skills to grasp, and it's certainly not an easy skills to assume and to practice. But do practice and do read as many, explanatory materials, instructional materials as you can, if only to further your understanding of the concept. Okay. So let me start talking about this PowerPoint. So before we can discuss or talk about what literary analysis is, let's make sure that we understand what it is not, because as an instructor, having taught this course for quite a few semesters, right, I've received quite a few essays over the year that are supposed to be literary analysis of some text, but they fail to be analytical in any way, shape, or form, right? And of course, when you turn in a literary analysis essay without any kind of interpretation or analysis or deep, close analysis of your chosen text at all, then you failed the assignment, right? So I thought that it's imperative that I start this discussion by really impressing upon you all what literary analysis is not. Okay, to really make you understand that, so that you won't produce an unqualified literary analysis essay, as it could cause you to fail the assignment. So literary analysis, is not a summary of the plot of a literary text, right? And by literary text, I mean any work of literature, such as a short story, novel, poem, or play. If there are other literary forms that are not mentioned here, right? But then please fill in the blank, right? But do not turn in a literary analysis essay that is mostly about what happens in the short story. You have to make the assumption, and if you read chapter 16, the textbook says this as well, when you're writing a literary analysis essay, you are writing to an audience that is assumed or that is presumed to have read the text that you're analyzing, the literary text that you're analyzing. So there is absolutely no need to summarize the whole thing. But you also find that throughout your literary analysis essay, you will find it necessary to paraphrase a certain passage or certain phrases or certain details or certain scene, for example, from a short story, right? But that brief paraphrase or account, of certain very small parts in the story do serve a purpose, okay? And the purpose is not to fill up the space of your essay, just so you can meet the minimum requirement, the minimum required length. Okay? But your entire essay or most of your essay should not be telling me what the short story is about. That would cause you to fail. Your literary analysis essay or literary analysis is not a review of a literary text. Okay? In our everyday life, we tend to act informally as a reviewer of things that we see, such as, especially in the arts, such as movies that we've seen or TV shows that are newly debuted, or ongoing television series, or we may review, somebody else's sense of fashion as well. So we actively in our everyday life, exercise this skill, this review skill. When you walk out of a movie or when you come home from a movie, from watching a movie in a theater, you may be asked by, your parents, your friends, your co-worker, or your, spouse, how was the movie that you saw over the weekend? And then you'll give, probably a pretty general impression of the movie itself, right? So what you're doing there is a kind of review, but it's informal, right? And you probably don't have to think too much or too deeply about the movie that you've seen in order to give your response to the how was the movie kind of question, okay? So, and that's not what you're doing in your literary analysis. You're not telling me what was good about the movie. I'm sorry, about the short story. You're not telling me, or you're not offering your general impression of the short story Okay. And and literary analysis is not an emotional response to the text. Okay, how it makes you feel, how it makes you, how the short story inspire you to feel about its subject matter in different light, or what you've learned from it, or anything like that. All of those would be, to some extent, an emotional response to the text, and that's not what analysis is about. Okay? Literary analysis is not an expression of what you like or do not like about the text. So in your literary analysis essay, do not tell me what what character you like best and what character, you couldn't wait to be killed off, or, how you think that the story should have ended, earlier than it does, should end earlier than it does, or how it should continue on, and that its ending place was kind of, ambiguous. It didn't really give any closure to the story because we still don't know what happened to the girl, for example. Okay, all of those would be inappropriate responses. All of those would be inappropriate expression in a literary analysis. And I'm sure there are more examples of what not to do in a literary analysis essay, but I can't think of anything right now. But anymore. But if more examples should occur to me, I will include them and adjust this presentation so that it reflects, as much examples as I can think of. But having said that, and having cautioned you all against what not to do in your literary analysis essay, let's talk about what it is that you actually do when you analyze a work of literature. Okay, literary means of or having to do with letters or the written language writing. Analysis means the process of breaking down and studying the different parts or components of a whole and their relations to one another. So literary is having to do with the written words. And that's very appropriate because when you're studying literature, that's all that you have is the written words, right? And to you, it may be lifeless at first, it may be inanimate, it may be passive, and it may seem not very dynamic, kind of boring, the written words as they appear on the page, right? But once you start thinking about a host of things that the written words can represent or symbolize or can imply, right? Then you realize that the written words can yield to very rich discussions about, you know, things that cannot be easily or quickly conveyed. Analysis means the process of breaking down and studying the different parts or components of a whole and their relations to one another. So what you're doing when you're analyzing is you're trying to understand how something works by looking, how something works as a whole perhaps, or how something works in general by looking at the different parts or different elements or components that make up the entire structure. So you study it, you see how each part functions. Okay, hold on. Okay, next slide. All right, so now that we've broken up the phrase literary analysis by considering what each of the terms mean, let's talk about what it means when you're analyzing a text of literature, a work of literature, literary text. All right. So pretty much the overall objective of literary analysis or analysis of a literary text is to arrive at a deeper meaning of what a work of literature means. What is it trying to say in this, in its creation of this, you know, um, made up word, right? What is it trying to tell us? Okay, what does it all mean? So, as a student of literature, really you're acting as a kind of detective or an investigator, right? You're thrown into this world that is, for the most part, unfamiliar to you, with unfamiliar people, unfamiliar characters, problems, problems and conflicts that you're not privy to, and it's your job as the analyst or detective or investigator, whatever you like to call yourself, um, right? It is your job or your determination, right, to make sense of this world and to understand why, for example, people are fighting, or why there is conflict going on, or why people act the way they do, or why they seem to act so strangely, for example, if that's the case. Okay, so your job is to look for signs and for signs through the written words in the literary text that will help you to kind of piece together these clues, so that together these clues will tell a story that means something, that these clues will help you to interpret this world, right? Help you to navigate and interpret and make meaning out of this word, right? Or meaning in some um, meaning in some aspects, some small aspect or some small dimension of the text, right? Because our job here is not to hope to understand every single puzzling thing about a literary text. That's really not what we're doing here, because that task would be almost impossible. I don't want to say completely impossible, because I like to leave, um, open doors for possibility, but it would almost be a monumental task to try to understand and to try to solve pretty much the unknown or mysterious, every unknown or mysterious or puzzling thing about, a literary text. Our job as analysts of literature, as students of literature, as critic of literature, is really to understand, is to hope to illuminate, to bring to light, to gain a deeper sense of insight and understanding about some aspect of the text, one aspect of the text in it. And if we can understand that as deeply as we could, right, then we can sit back and feel good about ourselves, because that's pretty much, the scope of what we can do and you can't really hope to find, a unified interpretation or uniform interpretation that will answer every single question that the text could possibly ask, or that any critic could possibly ask about the text, right? Our job is just to understand some small aspect of it, is to offer an interpretation or to offer a meaning of what a certain element in the text mean, right? Um, Another explanation I have here about what it is that we do when we analyze a work of literature is, of course, I've said before, we're trying to determine what a work of literature means or what it reveals to us beyond what is going on in the text, right? Beyond the apparent, the superficial, right? So our job is to kind of peel back the layers, right? To uncover mysteries, peel back the curtain so that we can get to, hopefully, the truth of things. It is an inquiry of how the different literary elements of a literary text interact to create meaning. All right. So as a critic of the text, okay, we're also trying to arrive at meaning by looking at, for signs in the text, for, the structure of the text and the different literary elements um, that make up the text, right? So the literary elements, if you think back to the term analysis and what it means to analyze, the process of analysis is breaking down the whole into its small part and studying the parts in very close details in order to gain an understanding of how the small part works and how it contributes to meaning, or how it contributes to the making of the sum of the whole, of the larger thing, right? And that part, and if you transfer that idea to literature, then the small parts of the whole are the literary elements, right? The literary elements are, I guess, the building blocks of a work of literature. Okay, they are those essential components that a work of literature must have in order for it to be intelligible or comprehensible at all, right? Understand that literary text can and often does have multiple possible meanings, not just one, and they can all be valid. Now, if you read chapter 16 on your own, especially the essay on the four ways of the four ways to talk about literature or something like that, okay, you'll note, or you'll see how many ways you'll get an understanding of how many ways or how many questions or how you can ask about a text, how many possible meanings the text can have, or how many possible interpretations, different critics can have about the entire about a text, and some of these interpretations may be very different from one another. Okay. All right, so we've talked about how the basic building blocks of any literary text are your literary elements. They are those essential parts, right, that make up the structure of any literary text. Now, a literary text may not have all literary elements, right, but it should have some literary elements in order for it to be recognizable as a work of literature, as a literary text that's trying to say something. So let's talk about some of these basic elements of a literary text, the basic building blocks that are so essential to the structure of any work of literature. All right. So first, so here you have, these are by no means, comprehensive. This is by no means a comprehensive list of elements, but you all know what characters are, right? In a literary text such as a short story, right? You gotta have characters, right? You gotta have the essential component of a short story, because short stories are stories about people, right? Or short stories are stories about characters that somewhat resemble people. If they're not people, maybe they're aliens or zombies, or there's some form of mankind or people, okay? They are called characters, right? Because it's hard to tell a story if you don't have any kind of central figures or figures to kind of anchor your perspective to. Okay, because stories are about something, and your characters can also be animals, right? As long as they're, or your characters can sometimes be non-living things, right? Machines or robots, these can all be characters, right? They are just figures that the story centers around. You can a short story or a poem can also have figurative language. Figurative language are symbolic language, or language that are metaphorical in nature, or abstract language that aims to convey something without saying directly what it is. Okay, imagery is the you know imagery is the type of images that a literary text have, and usually, of course, it has significance, right? So if you like to write a literary analysis essay focusing on the imagery, the images, on the different images that the story have or a poem have, and and what the images mean, or how each of the image contribute to, the meaning of the poem, okay, then you can certainly do that if there's a lot of really significant images in the literary text that you're looking at. You can also look at theme, point of view, setting, style, tone, and so forth. All right, so when you're performing an analysis of a literary text, okay, you are probably prompted to do so in a class such as this class, English 1101. Okay, I can imagine, you're being at work, if you work in an office or anywhere else, your boss coming up to you one day and say, write me a literary analysis on, you know, on Raymond Carver's The Cathedral. Okay, if your boss came to you and said that one day, you would probably look at him or her like, they were out of their mind. So the environment or the setting in which you will be prompted to write a literary analysis of a text or analysis of a literary text would be probably, your English classes, or, in an academic course, setting, right? Which means your analysis will have to be formal. And most of the time, the analysis, if not all of the time, well, most of the time, the analysis the form will be taking the form of an essay. All right. All right. So in your literary analysis essay, we've talked about what it is that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to offer an interpretation of some meaning of the text, some aspect of the text, what that aspect means. So in essence, when you're doing that, you're really making an argument about the significance of one or some elements of a text. And then after making your argument, or after offering or your interpretation in the introduction, you will provide, supporting evidence to make your argument sound and convincing, to persuade your audience that your interpretation is viable, right? That your interpretation has convincing supporting evidence, and it should be considered seriously. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the structure of a literary analysis essay. Okay. In your reading of chapters 2 to 6 in your textbook, which talk about the writing process, as well as, I hope, you've reviewed the supplemental materials that I provided in Module 1 regarding the basic structure of the essay and the writing process. Based on that reading, based on those reading materials, you should know by now that that the shorter essays that you'll be writing in this class, well, will take the 5-paragraph basic structure, and the structure of any academic essay should always have these 3 components: introduction, body, and conclusion, right? No matter how long or short the essay is. As you advance in your academic career and you decide to, for example, seek a higher degree, an advanced degree, a graduate degree in your field of study, right, you will be prompted, hopefully, to write longer, more complex essays, to share your graduate level kind of thinking with the academic community, right? So your essays will undoubtedly, get more complex, and complexity has to be accommodated by length. So the longer, I'm sorry, so the more complex an essay is, the longer it tends to be. But the one thing that will not be altered, no matter what kind, no matter how long of an essay you write, and the one thing that longer, more complex essays will always have in common with these shorter, basic ones that we're learning to write in, um, freshman level, such as this, is that they both share the same essential components of academic writing, which are introduction, body, and conclusion. All right, so likewise, your literary analysis essay will have the introduction and everything that the introduction must have, all the elements and the pattern of development that an introduction should have, right? It will also end with a thesis statement. Now, the thesis statement in a literary analysis essay will tell your reader, right, what element of the literary text you are analyzing, right, and what kind of meaning you made of it in your analysis, right? So you offer an interpretation of that meaning. I'm sorry, so you offer an interpretation of your of the aspect of the text that you're focusing on, that you're analyzing, right? You tell your reader what you think it means. For example, if you're analyzing a specific character and you want to understand their motivations or their desires, why they act so strangely and out of character with the rest of the characters in the story, right? Why they don't seem to be bound by any moral code or code of conduct that everyone else, for example, seem to be following, right? You want to understand just a deeper motivation and desires, right? And you want to kind of peel off these superficial outer layers that they wear every day, and you want to get to the heart of the truth about the character, right? If that's your focus, then your thesis statement at the end of your introduction will tell your reader exactly what you found after you peeled off all the layers, after you've analyzed the character as deeply as you could. So that's your interpretation of the characters, right? And that should be expressed at the end of the introduction in the thesis statement. Okay, so there are some sample thesis statement here, just like at the beginning of this lecture. I started by talking about, what you should not do in your literary analysis, what you should not be writing about in your literary analysis essay, right? The thesis statement is pretty much the heart of any essay. No matter what type of essay you write, you gotta tell your reader at the end of the introduction, right, what this essay is about. And then you develop it and support it in the body. Well, with the literary analysis essay, okay, it is very important that your thesis statement is deep, insightful, original, meaningful, and critical and interpretive. Critical and or interpretive. Okay. Um, it should offer not just your opinion about what it is that you're focusing on or writing about, but it should offer, a carefully arrived at, interpretation of what it means. So it has to be grounded in some kind of system of evidence and support that you can gather from the text. Okay, so factual thesis statements in a literary analysis essay are not acceptable. So make sure that your thesis statement for the literary analysis essay, do not contain factual statement about what happens in the story. And this is related to my caution, to my earlier cautioning you against writing a literary analysis essay that simply tells me what the short story is about. right? So this is kind of related to that. So a factual thesis statement would tell me what happens in the story, okay? Which would be wrong because it doesn't tell me what it means or how you make sense of it or how you've interpreted beyond what it means. So don't tell me, for example, that the story of an hour, which is one of your short stories assigned, the story of an hour is about a woman's grief, a woman's joyful, inwardly joyful reaction to the news of her husband's death. Okay, that's what the story is about. That's not insightful. You're not telling me anything new or original, and you're not helping me to make sense of anything about the story. You're not telling me, you're not helping me to understand why a wife would find the occasion of her husband's death be a momentous, joyful, celebratory occasion. You're not allowing me, or you're not helping me to understand the text in a deeper way. Okay? So that's what I mean by factual thesis statements. And if you've read the short story called The Things They Carry, or the excerpt, The Things They Carry, right? Then factual thesis statements about that short story would be, could be these examples here. The Things They Carry is about America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Not insightful at all. I know that's what it's about. It's set in the jungle of Vietnam. Lieutenant Cross in The Things They Carry daydreams too much about Martha. Okay? So these unacceptable thesis statement, right, is about a major character in the short story Lieutenant Cross, but it's not offering any insight about Lieutenant Cross's character or state of mind or psychology or blah blah or anything like that. It simply tell me what I already know from reading the story, that he does daydream too much about a girl back at home named Martha. Okay? The soldiers in The Things They Carried are too young to be in the war. This is also stated in the short story. So again, you're not telling me anything about the soldiers, their involvement, and what it means in a broader scale. So you're not telling me anything significant about the story that I can learn from, that I can, that help me to understand the stories better. So all of these are examples of unacceptable thesis statements because they're not insightful. Now, to go to the total opposite end of that kind of thesis statement would be to have a thesis statement that offers a deep, insightful, critical interpretation about an element of the text beyond the obvious and factual. Okay? So an insightful or critical and interpretive thesis statement would sound something like this. The figure of Martha in The Things They Carry represents America's emotional distance from and apathetic attitude about the Vietnam War. So this thesis statement, right, sees in the figure of Martha, right, something bigger than what she would appear to be, right? This reading of the text, okay, gives more significance to Martha and think that she means something, that she symbolizes something, that she's not merely just a girl that Lieutenant Cross remembers from home and holds on to as a means to kind of to help him, to survive the harsh, atrocious reality of the war, right? She represents, and even though she never appears, in the actual story itself, right? She does appear in Lieutenant Cross's mind, right? So she does make a somewhat appearance and like an apostrophe or something, okay? And her appearance, right, does mean something. So to this author, to this critic, or this writer of the thesis statement, right, seems to interpret Martha's significance as as some kind of a representation of America's attitude towards the war, right? That is completely valid, and that is certainly insightful, and we can certainly learn something from this thesis statement in terms of how Martha can be viewed. Okay, so this is the kind of things that we're looking for. This is the kind of things that we're talking about when we say, offer a deep, insightful, critical interpretation. We gotta go beyond what is obvious in the text, right, and figure out how each of these elements, such as the character, the figure of Martha, functions, what they're supposed to represent, what they're supposed to mean, and what they're supposed to say about, the big picture. So for your story, let me see, The Story of an Hour and Good Country People. Okay, you can certainly, there are certain, the two short stories certainly have very compelling characters that, if you're interested in pursuing, if you're interested in, figuring out different characters in these two stories, right? I certainly think that the characters in those two stories will lend themselves to your analysis because they are very, very interesting. And if you, you know, um, ask relevant questions, that should help you to gain a deeper understanding of how that characters function and what they contribute and how they contribute to the text and all of that. If you pursue that deeply enough, I think that you will come up with something, very insightful, or you can come up with something very insightful. All right, so the body of the literary analysis essay is where you develop and support your thesis, okay, or some aspect of the thesis. And then your conclusion should, reassert your essay's main argument, reiterate the major supporting tone, but your concluding major supporting detail evidence, and your concluding statement should also be insightful about the overall significance and value of the literary text. So you're not just simply restating what's already been said in the essay, but you also want to kind of wrap it up, and you want to wrap it up in an insightful way. Say something significant overall about the value of the literary text and why it's worth studying, or things like that, but do not raise a different idea in your conclusion. Okay, I will post another video lecture, another online lecture sometime later this week, and in that video, in that lecture, I will talk specifically about the literary analysis essay structure itself, and I'll have a different PowerPoint for us to follow, and I'll have more specific examples. But in the meantime, if you haven't read the two short stories, go ahead and read them. If you've read them only once last week when I prompted you to do so, make sure that you read it again, okay? Because remember, when you're analyzing something, you're looking closely at it, and to look closely at it, you have to know it pretty well. So read your short stories at least 2 times. Read the first time for a general understanding of what's going on, and the second time pay close attention to certain details, and the second time read with the view of, focusing on, an aspect of the stories that interests you, and trying to see as much of it as you can. And by see, I mean, quote unquote, trying to see, quote unquote, as much of it as you can. And post to the short story discussion board.